Dick Roman, who's author of Continental, Crucible, Big Business, Workers and Unions in the Transformation of North America, which he wrote in conjunction with Ador Velasco, and is an important kind of an examination of post-NAFTA Mexico in the context of what's been happening to the labor movement and class struggles in the 3 NAFTA states since NAFTA. And Dick will be speaking, he put a conjuncture and possibilities, but he's going to map out and deal with many of the dimensions of the current crisis and struggles in Mexico.
Thanks, Greg. It's hard to follow that poem. I want to make about 5 or 6 points about the present moment in Mexico and elements towards trying to figure out what may be possible, because I think we're at a moment in Mexico of incredible fluidity and unpredictability. Perhaps the only thing that's predictable is that it's going to be very violent and bloody for a period at least. The first point I want to make is that Judy and Anna spoke about a little bit is that there's a crisis of legitimacy of the regime. And the crisis isn't just because of the violence, it's because the transition from the old regime of the ruling party, of the single party, what someone called the perfect, Vargas Llosa, or the perfect dictatorship, that transition has failed in creating any sense of legitimacy among the population. Because while the old regime relied tremendously on repression, assassinations, it also relied on co-optation and nurturing hope. Peasants hoping that one day they would get their chance to get land in land reform, that there would be an improved standard of living, if not for you, for your kids. Those kinds of hopes have been destroyed one after another by the regime. Land reform was declared over by Salinas. Wages, living standards have declined in the last 30 years. The regime had a system of control and legitimation, even though it was a one-party regime, even though repression was powerful. But what's happened with the demise of the old regime of domination is that there's a crisis of legitimacy, there's a crisis of security, of personal endangerment, and the violence by the state and by the gangs. There's a loss of power of the central state over regions, it doesn't even control some areas. There's a democratic transition that never really was a democratic transition and is viewed by most people in Mexico today as having failed. All of the major political parties are in near total disrepute. There's a destruction of hope. Now this crisis of the regime, which has been crystallized in the mobilizations following the massacre and disappearances of the student teachers, this crisis of the regime creates a very dangerous moment, because if it can't rely on legitimation, it relies more and more on violence. And the country has been going through a militarization in many aspects. More and more military people are involved, are recruited for policing functions. The military has taken over policing functions in many areas. The private security companies that have grown by leaps and bounds are often manned by former military people. And some of the former military and present military are very intertwined with the drug gangs. The moment is especially bad because on top of the crisis of legitimacy and the tremendous anger that people feel, there is a brewing economic crisis. There's an incipient economic crisis in Mexico. Standards of living have been falling for a couple of decades. But now we're at the beginning with the fall, perhaps long-term, perhaps not, of the price of oil means that the peso is falling. It's fallen 20% in the last few days. That means inflation is going to go up because of all the dependence of Mexico on imports. It means the real standard of living is going to get worse. And it means that there's going to be a fiscal crisis of the regime because 1/3 of public finances come from oil revenues. 1/3. The president and his top military officials have made very clear threats about the use of force. The recent comment by the president, as insensitive as perhaps as a young man can't say, I'm tired of this message, was that let's move beyond the massacre. He said, let's move on to progress. He said that visiting Continental to inaugurate an economic development. An admiral of the Navy just said that the parents of the missing students who have been very militantly mobilizing people and demanding the return of their kids, the parents are being manipulated by subversive forces. The fragmented protests that had already been developing all over the country over the neoliberal assault on the countryside have mushroomed, and now protests are going on throughout the country. Monterrey, big industrial city in the north, conservative city. Guadalajara, the second biggest city in Mexico, have had major demonstrations. The demonstrations have not been just confined to, though they've been most strong in, the poorer states and the federal district, which is normally the center of protests. One point that I want to make is that Mexico has been integrated into the continent in a deep way that didn't exist at the time of the Mexican Revolution. It didn't exist until the last few decades. A large part of the Mexican working class either works in the US as undocumented or works in US Canadian-controlled firms in Mexico in the Maquila region. Mexico, through NAFTA and through economic continental integration, is an integral part of the EU North American production system. And that means that very big stakes are involved for the US and Canada, especially in what happens in Mexico. Secondly, Mexico is very important to the US in terms of energy security. This is talked about very openly by US think tanks, by US officials. It's part of the energy security plan, is that Mexico is a key part of that. And it not only does it provides tremendous opportunities for profit making. And this is why top US officials love Enrique Peña Nieto. And I've been debating whether to read this or not because of time, but I'm going to read a little of it. 3 days before the massacre, coincidentally 3 days before, in New York City, Enrique Peña Nieto was honored by the Council on Foreign Relations, the elite think tank in the US. In the event at the Council of Foreign Relations, he was interviewed by Robert Rubin. It was a dialogue instead of a speech. Robert Rubin, former Treasury Secretary of the US, former head of Goldman Sachs, and now co-chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations. Rubin, I'm co-chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations, and I welcome you today to the lecture with our distinguished guest, President of Mexico, who I first met about 3 years ago before he was president. He came to my office and he said, quote, "We're going to do all these wonderful things," unquote. And I said, "That seems unlikely." "Well, you've done them." Laughter from the audience. And then, none other than Henry Kissinger, the engineer of the coup in Chile, where neoliberalism was introduced through terror also, gave Peña Nieto on the same day the World Statesman Award from the Appeal of Conscience Foundation. And he goes on to say how much he's accomplished in Mexico, how bold he's been, and how Mexico, and he said, quote, "I think we can learn much from our southern neighbor." Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the Mexico crisis is a North American crisis. The U.S. is deeply involved. The U.S. militarily is deeply involved through Plan Merida. And the involvement of the U.S. will escalate if protests and challenges to the regime escalate. The other part of the integration of Mexico into the U.S. that's politically very important is all of the Mexican nationals who live in the U.S., undocumented and some documented. There is a population of estimated 10, 12 million undocumented Mexicans in the U.S., many more Mexicans who of various generations who live in the U.S., generally are poor, part of the working class, and as the U.S. involvement deepens in Mexico, it raises interesting political questions for resistance to the U.S. domination. So what I want to, again, underline is the continental aspects of the crisis in Mexico. The third point that I want to make is that a point that's often forgotten is that Mexico is not a rural country, not a peasant country. The most dynamic resistance in Mexico today is rural. It's peasants, it's campesinos. But Mexico is 75% urban. And Mexico is a working class country, even though much of the working class is in the informal sector. Most Mexicans receive wages of various kinds. Low wages, miserable wages, but it's an urban working class country. And so a struggle to transform Mexico will have to move from the countryside into the cities. The working class participates, and very strongly, in protests, but it doesn't participate to date as an organized working class in any manner. The working class generally, in the 2006 protests about the fraudulent election, and today in the protests about the massacre, most of the people who participate are working people. But they participate as members of neighborhoods, as citizens, and so on. Why? Because the working class is not organized as a working class. The historical institutional structure of state-dominated, corrupt unions means that that still exists, though in a much weaker form, means that there's not a strong workplace resistance culture, there's not a strong cross-workplace culture, and there's not a union movement that is able to mobilize at the workplace. Because what is going to be needed eventually, I think, is resistance at the workplace and a general strike that closes the economy down. It may not come to that. It may come to more like the Bolivia model, where barricades in the streets may be the form of resistance. But resistance in the workplace could be very significant, especially in the Maquila region, where it will be very hard to come by, to do. I'm not so much trying to give you conclusions because I'm not clear what the conclusions should be, but elements towards an analysis. We have to take into account the continental dimension, and we have to take into account the working class urban character of contemporary Mexico. And the last, another thing I want to mention is that, and I won't go into any details, the tremendous growth of the Mexican military and paramilitary forces, and the tremendous growth of private military forces. The drug gangs have tremendous military resources. I don't know what a reliable estimate would be, Some people talk about 500,000 in all the drug gangs. Some of them very well on. There now are citizen militias developing to try to protect communities against the depredations of the drug gangs and the army. We're at the beginning of what's going to be, in my view, a long and difficult struggle in Mexico. There's not going to be any short-term resolution, I think. In closing, I want to make a few points. One is the left is very strong and incredibly weak. It's strong in the sense that there are very strong leftist traditions in Mexico in popular culture, tremendous militancy, but it is so diverse, fragmented, with no central strategic conception of how to change things. It's right now, I would say, the major division of those who carry out very militant tactics, but often with very reformist goals. And that sometimes is the case of the teachers. It's a very tricky thing, being a union and being an insurgent force. On the one hand, there's the seduction of concessions that may be made to this group or that group. The government just made a concession to the remnant of the Power Workers Union that they destroyed a few years ago. The Power Workers Union, the ESME, was a fulcrum for many protests and very nationalist protests. A deal has been cut and they're not in the forefront at this moment. Very difficult. Their members were suffering. They've been unemployed for years, those who refused to take a lousy buyout. The other tendency that's very strong, more in some of the indigenous movements, and especially in the Zapatistas, is a very dangerous tendency, and that is to say the state doesn't matter. We can make changes and ignore the state by building utopian communities here and there. The state can destroy the Zapatistas when it wants to. It doesn't want to for tactical reasons, because of the mobilizations, etc. But the state matters. The state matters. The state, even though the fragmented, repressive state matters, not only does it matter as an enemy, it matters as a weapon of transformation. Because any kind of transformation of Mexico will require that the insurgent forces take over the state, transform the character of the state in terms of democratic control, and use the state to fight against the inevitable attacks to destroy it that will come from the US and Canada. There is no way that the US is going to step aside and allow even a Keynesian kind of Mexico to emerge. Not to mention a leftist Mexico, a Mexico like Venezuela, or Mexico like Bolivia, at the doorstep of the US is unimaginable. It's going to be a tremendous struggle. And that's where international and continental solidarity is fundamental. It's fundamental that progressives build more links between Mexicans, the Mexican struggles, and North American struggles. That they build links, and it's been very interesting and heartening in this nightmare moment that there is been attempts by Latinos and blacks in the US to link the two struggles. And there's a very good article on the web today in Counterpunch by Enrique and Gilda Ochoa called Ferguson and Ayotzinapa, which talks about the similarities and the oppressions of the Mexican people and the black people and Latinos in the US. Those links are important. And I think, as I argue one have been accused as over-optimism in the book that Ador and I wrote, that the presence of large numbers of Mexican workers within the U.S. could, in certain circumstances, and I think they're emerging, could be a force for turning around U.S. unions in a more militant direction, which they desperately need to turn around for themselves, but also in terms of the struggles in Mexico. Thank you.